podcast. Adam and I here today will be discussing innovation. So, Adam,
Yeah, it's an
what
interesting
questions have you
topic.
got?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic. So I think to start with, I think we need to just cover what actually is innovation. I think it's a topic that's obviously very spoken about within the industry and in the common world today. And I think even doing prior research, people are unsure of what innovation is. I mean, when you look into Google, it says the action of or process of innovating is what innovation is. So
Yeah.
I think it's quite unclear to some what actually is innovation. So, and obviously yourself have got prior knowledge to, worked in the industry for a while and worked on, had an article within Forbes and know what, innovation is. So I think starting on what actually is innovation is a great start.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I'm glad you looked it up on Google as well because it's a circular definition, and I think there's a lot of research. There's still research happening in that space.
Yeah.
The first distinction people draw, obviously, is you've got inventions and then you've got innovations. So inventions are obviously things like the wheel, maybe discovery, to an extent fire, or the God particle recently, at CERN laboratories. So there's that distinction that one needs to understand.
Yeah.
And when you actually start talking about innovation, you can understand it in the perspective of the markets and what sort of technology is being built upon the predecessor. So a good example here is you've got televisions, obviously, and then you've had these flat panel screens, which are just growing in size every year. So that's an incremental innovation. And then you have these disruptive things, which are still building upon stuff that has been created before them, but they're doing it in a very unique way. So they've got a very disruptive market or maybe an iteration. So I think a good example there is obviously what Gillette did with some of their blades. I think up until then you had to dispose the blade and all of that, and they kind of created this new razor that had stuff built into it.
Yes.
So it was use and throw. So that's a good way of understanding it. You've got USB sticks, which kind of replaced all the storage devices. Up until that point, you could think of CD-ROMs or Blu-ray discs and things like that, right?
Yes,
So that's just how you could understand things. So it's essentially the kinds of tech that you're looking at and the markets. And if there is something before that that was already evolving in a certain direction and the innovation happens to take it at a faster pace or maybe in a different direction. So that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, so I think, obviously researching this, I think one of the big misconceptions and things that people seem to struggle to understand is this difference between innovation and invention. I think obviously those words are used together a lot of the time, so I think understanding actually what the difference is between them, obviously like you mentioned, there's incremental innovation and then there's disruptive innovation, and we've got radical innovation and architectural innovation. So there's all these different types of innovation, and then you've got invention. I think it's easy to see why people are struggling to see the differences and talking on the topic of innovation, knowing what actually that actually is. I think is obviously something that people struggle to understand.
Yeah, I think I completely understand why, because of so many domains, and it could just happen anywhere. Like you could pick any industry, any sector, and there is some kind of innovation happening there. So a lot of times there is an effort to oversimplify things as far as innovations are concerned to reach to the masses, and in the process you start listening to things which sound very similar, so perhaps even misrepresented, right? So you could be perhaps discussing iPhone, and when it first came out, definitely very radical because it had the touch screen and all of that, after which it sort of settled down to incremental innovations that have been coming out every year and a half or two. So that's a great way of understanding things. So if you give an example, that's when people will be able to relate to it better. Without which, obviously, you see all kinds of definitions flying around. So that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, and with it being a word that's used so often nowadays, every new product that comes out, they're using the word innovative. So I suppose that creates a confusion for people of understanding, is that what I mean, obviously I've got an article here why the 50 most innovative companies of 2023.
Is that the BCG report?
It is, yeah. So number one is Apple, which obviously in the eyes of a lot of people this year, in 2023, could argue that obviously they weren't innovative, but I think when we look at what innovation actually is, the incremental innovation, then they obviously are being innovative, bringing out a new iPhone, a new MacBook that are incrementally better than the last one that came out. Whether we're seeing bigger jumps of innovation is up for argument's sake, but I mean, when we look at the rest, number 2 is Tesla, number 3 is Amazon, 4 Alphabet, but within our industry, the first one doesn't come until number 13, being SpaceX.
And that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there anything that you think on that topic?
I think that's a great summary. You'd perhaps want to look at reports like these because they invest a lot of time and effort into building these analyses, and they've got a methodology which is super critical when you're evaluating innovations. And I believe the eventual score sort of determines where companies would end up on that list. It would be good to see them based on sectors, but it also helps to see it all together as a macro level industry understanding. So it doesn't surprise me that Apple is consistently featured up there because they've had this, banger of like a launch with the iPhone. And they were doing a lot of things before that as well, right? They had these music players and they had a whole bunch of things going on in the computing world. And then they brought all those things together really well into this device, which just took off, and then they've been innovating consistently ever since then. And there's metrics like how many people are adopting it, is it impacting the revenues, and all these things come into picture when you refer to a company innovating. And to the question around aerospace industry, I think it's pretty obvious that things have slowed down over the last couple of decades, or even 3 or 4 decades, I would say. The best example is the Concorde supersonic jet, which was accessible as a commercial avenue for people a few decades ago. No longer is in operations today. So that's the equivalent of having an iPhone 9 next year once you already started using 12 maybe, or 14. So that's how things have sort of regressed in that sense. But things are catching up. There's some exciting stuff going on. But you can't think of anything other than SpaceX. Again, that's a great example. They've not invented rockets. They've been around for a very long time. But they've understood how you can make them reusable, which would drop down the costs for a lot of launches. And that's going to lead to a lot of adoption, and it's an incremental innovation in that way. But there could be a million things in the rocket that could be very disruptive. So it all depends on how you package it. So the frameworks are super critical. So that BCG list is a great way of understanding at a company level how things are performing.
I think that's a great point, and I think to touch on a little bit, I think of what you mentioned in that was the how people can understand innovation. So you mentioned there was certain measures that we can look at for innovation. I didn't know if you wanted to touch on those a little bit more, so that these are what people can look for to know that what innovation is actually happening. So you mentioned in what you just said about the how to quantify what innovation is. I don't know if you wanted to touch on that a little bit more, so that people can start to look for these things and really truly understand what that innovation the company is supposedly bringing to the table.
I think that's a great question. Quantifying innovation is extremely critical for companies to understand things like returns on investment and penetration, adoption, user adoption, and things like that. So you could look at it in a bidimensional way. The first one is obviously the tech itself and what's actually going into building the tech. So if it's really disruptive, people could be getting patents, or they could be keeping trade secrets, and they're building things in a very unique way. So a good example is, again, Tesla. I think they're trying to reduce the manufacturing footprint and make it very efficient. So they're innovating in the manufacturing space. But the end result is to make sure that people have access to very efficient electric vehicles. And then you've got the market penetration itself, where you're looking at the number of people that are actually adopting that innovation. And if it's something that's not happened before and people started using it just for that product, that's a good sign of how disruptive that product is. So again, electric vehicles is a great example. And if people have not used electric toothbrushes before, and Philips had created something in that space, that's a very disruptive model for that space. But they haven't invented the toothbrush as such, but they've created new things on an existing model and made sure more people were adopting it. So that's a good way of combining the metrics to quantify how efficient that innovation is, or how widespread the impact of that innovation is.
I think that's a good point, and touching on that, obviously sometimes innovation isn't always seen in terms of the final product, like you touched on with Tesla. One of their latest innovations is how they're manufacturing their cars, and they've sort of taken the traditional way of obviously taking a car in parts and putting it together on a longer runway. But now they've taken certain parts of the car and then putting together finally, so that they're not getting in each other's way, which is innovative in that space, but not necessarily seen in the final product, which is obviously where that confusion can sometimes happen. So I think that's an interesting point to touch on. And again, you touched on the point of how innovation is sometimes really disruptive because of it solving a problem. Like with incremental innovation, with the Apple, they're not solving a problem when they're making a camera a little bit better, whereas Tesla having reusable rockets is solving a problem. So do you think that sometimes in that case innovation is seen as more as a bigger thing when it's solving a problem, and then innovation that's not necessarily solving a problem isn't seen as being as standout?
I think I have a few, I guess, contrarian viewpoints in that space. A lot of times when people immerse themselves in this problem-centric view, I think they kind of restrict themselves to a very specific problem set, which is what is leading to very specific innovations to solve that inefficiency in a sector or a process. But will that have widespread impact? That I have my doubts on. So a good example is I'd like to believe Apple did not carry out a focus group study to ask people, maybe you should probably switch from keypads to like something that's more touchscreen, right? But they would have had their own methodologies internally, but they came up with this thing, and there wasn't a burning need in the user base to have a touchscreen, built into the phones. So that was something that just came and swept the entire industry, right? So I think there is two ways of looking at it. So the problem-centric view is important. It works for certain industries, but to have a widespread impact, I think it's good to keep your canvas really blank, and you start in a way that could capture more, as you move along the way, versus saying, here's my industry, this is that very specific problem, I'd like for this to be solved with something super innovative. And so maybe you're restricting the potential of that innovation in that space is how I think of it. But I'm also respectful of the fact that a lot of people take the problem-centric view and they essentially define what the problem is. The whole conversation around, if you ask people about maybe cars back in the day, they would have asked for faster horses, sort of a thing. So the problem there was my horse is not fast enough. So you're probably going to end up feeding the horse something or making it really efficient so it could run faster. Versus saying, I don't want to use the horse, I want to use something else. So that's a good way of how I see it. But I totally understand the incremental innovation survives on the whole problem statement. Define the problem, how could you make things better and keep building off on it.
And I think that's a good point. Obviously, from a design point of view, putting yourself in someone's shoes, obviously, and looking at how their life is and what problems they have is how problems are solved. But like you said, sometimes those problems can't be seen from those point of view. They're going through their life and living day to day with those problems, but not necessarily seeing that they're a problem. Like you said, going from a BlackBerry phone using a keypad to then an Apple phone that's full touchscreen was something people couldn't conceive. That's why obviously Steve Jobs is very famously say that they don't go over focus groups and they're not asking people what they want. They're saying, customers don't know what they want, the users don't know it. it's only us that can provide that for them. So I think it's a good point to showcase sometimes that innovation isn't something that is very clear. It's sometimes, and even it can be before its time. We look at the Google Lens, that was, early 2000s, and now it's, obviously we're coming just before the Apple conference, and they're supposedly going to be unveiling their new AR technology and a headset, which, obviously Google came out with in the early 2000s, and nearly 20 years later, we're coming back to this technology. So do you think that can sometimes be a factor as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Going back to my framework point, which is why you need to have the right methodology to assess that situation. And a lot of times these things are better understood backwards. So fantastic example. You had the Google glasses, right? I don't think there was anything inherently, less innovative about that tech, but it just did not work in the market. So if you go about assessing it on the metrics of adoption, consumer consumption, or revenues and profits and all of those kinds of metrics, it may not feature up there. But if you're just purely looking at it from the perspective of bringing this augmented reality tech into your glasses, it certainly did the job. But it would just take someone else to come up with a unique use case, business model for it to essentially be adopted at a wide scale. And then you'd start talking about it. So it's a good possibility that Apple might end up doing something very creative with it inside a different architecture altogether that would start appealing to people.
Yeah.
So you've got a bit of a brand influence there as well. So there is an inherent expectation that Apple is going to launch something. A few years ago it was about the Apple Car, but then I think they realized everything in that space is tough. They're now trying their hand at streaming and content production. So there's simultaneously lots of things going on.
Yeah.
But I've always maintained this thing that it's very impractical for one company to be good at everything.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see that play out very quickly with different companies trying to get into different verticals. And you could go on and on and on this. Like Google's tried their hand at hardware. Maybe Apple's now looking at, automobiles and augmented reality headsets. So it's a very different conversation that's understood as you start getting more data points from how things have been deployed into the market, and then their scope of adoption.
Yeah.
And then if you just go by what's gone into the tech, I'm sure there's a lot of breakthrough technologies that did not make it to a certain scale that we don't talk about today, simply because they did not have the right business model, or maybe the right adoption, right tech, wrong time, too early in some cases. So all these things come into play.
Yeah, and I think touching on that point, I think again, the right tech, wrong time, I think is very prominent in, some of the products we look at. Constantly we're going past in the street electric scooters and now electric bikes and even electric skateboards. And, one of the big innovations that was in the early, it must have been around the 2010 time, was the Segway. And obviously that innovation has never really followed through, and you'd think in today's world that would have been something that was, we're constantly trying to improve people's mobility, make it easier for people, but for some reason that innovation never followed through.
Yeah, and that's a great example, right? Would you call that a failure, or is it an innovation in the first place? I think it is. It had the right adoption as well.
Yeah.
But if you just add the market adoption metric into the entire evaluation framework, the company filed for bankruptcy and the product will no longer be available in the next 5 or 10 years. So it just becomes a relic, for people to look at and say, yeah, this was a good spot. But there is something, I believe there's a group of people now looking at such innovations and trying to bring them back into the markets.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll come back in a different form and shape.
Yeah.
Maybe it could fly like a hoverboard.
Yeah.
So
fly.
So there's lots of things that we could do, but a good time is also very critical. Sometimes it could be early, or you're just in a bad market, environment where for some reason things just did not fall in place. So that's perhaps the case for Segway.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously touching on where the world is at the minute, there's always a need for things. Obviously coming out of COVID, the healthy part of the world really wanted to rise again, and that was where the innovations in health tech have really kicked on. When you look at brands like Whoop, you know, people wanting to track their health has really kicked on, and so like you said, it really does depend on time. And touching on that and more on the industry that we're in, we look at some of the innovations, like you mentioned, Concorde. Like, you think in today's world we'd be even, obviously we had an article recently about London to Sydney in 2 hours, which is obviously how you'd expect Concorde to have gone to those heights, but again, that didn't really move. And you know, even looking at the Hindenburg airships and stuff, which again is very innovative technology and something that wasn't really utilised to its possible benefit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Again, analyses, frameworks, there's something called pest analyses, where you have a variable called political, environmental, and social aspects that impact technology. So I'd like to believe Hindenburg had something to do with politics, geopolitics of the day, because one disaster cannot put the entire tech away, because you know, you've had quite a few disasters with aircrafts, but people still fly them.
Yeah.
I think airships are a great way to consider alternative technologies. There could be other applications like cargo. But going back to the example of Concorde, I think there is an effort now to bring commercial supersonic flight back to the skies. Hopefully after 2025, we're going to have these things again active. And then there's hypersonics as well. There are, I think, a couple of companies now exploring commercial hypersonic travel, which is extremely exciting because it's like Mach 5. And then you have human spaceflight, obviously what we're looking at. But I think there's going to be a gradual push now again to move in the direction of exploring more pathways to make travel faster from the perspective of a standard airline journey today, which might last, if you're flying between continents, anywhere to like 10 to 12 hours, and that's a full day. And if you're doing the long haul flights, you know, you're pretty much losing out 2 to 3 days. So if I think I read somewhere SpaceX plans to do point A to point B on the planet within 30 minutes if you have access to a launch pad. Now that's the kind of stuff that you'd want to be talking about, because the biggest breakthrough from the Wright brothers happened maybe 100 years ago. So the incremental innovations should build upon it and give us access to cleaner travel, faster travel, safer travel, so people are able to access these destinations much faster.
Yeah, and I think obviously looking at where we came from, like you mentioned, coming from horses to then cars, that seems the natural evolution to then always want things quicker. You know, we look at bullet trains and obviously those types of technology in aerospace that never seemed to carry on. Like, and obviously, like you said, hopefully now that's going to become more of a prominent thing.